Welcome, folks. We are entering the second half of chapter 5. So we're going to talk about cognitive development in infancy. Remember last time we talked about physical development, but now we're gearing into what's going on in their little minds during these first 2 years of life. So how are infants and toddlers learning and processing information? What's going on in their little heads? So we're going to start by talking about the sensorimotor period of development according to Piaget. So we're going back to Piaget's major theory. And we already briefly covered his first two substages, but we'll just do a little recap here. So first of all, as a recap to the whole period of development, sensorimotor, if we break apart the word sensorimotor, it gives us a clue into what it's about. Sensory and motor. They're exploring the world through both their senses and their motor abilities. So they're actively engaging with objects in their environment, and this is furthering their development. So that's really what's going on in this 2-year period according to Piaget. And now let's get into these first two substages as kind of a little recap. So we learned about the first substage, which is called exercising reflexive schemas from that first month of life. What's going on here is we're just going back to those involuntary reflexes that we covered: rooting, grasping, sucking, even things like looking around and listening. During this first month, they're really just learning to control and coordinate these reflexes. Moving into the second substage, we have primary circular reactions from 1 to 4 months approximately. So they're beginning to modify and repeat their behaviors now. So it's no longer just the reflexes and coordinating them. They're actually experimenting a little, modifying things. Specifically, they're repeating pleasurable actions toward themselves, toward their own bodies, usually things that are discovered accidentally as a result of their reflexes. If we remember any examples of this, things like thumb sucking or blowing bubbles from the mouth or kicking their legs, these could all be examples of primary circular reactions. They typically extend from reflexes, but the baby finds it interesting and fun or something along those lines, so they repeat it over and over. But at this point, remember that it is still limited to their own bodies, not really interacting with objects in the environment yet. So those are the first two substages in those first few months of life that are really setting the stage for the next 4 substages, where they're really starting to interact with things in their environment and furthering their cognitive development by doing so. So let's move into substage 3, secondary circular reactions. So at this point, they're becoming aware that their own actions can have an effect on the environment around them. So they're starting to explore beyond their own bodies, and they're becoming interested in producing changes in the environment. They're realizing that objects are more than just an extension of their own actions, but they actually have their own separate identities. So they are repeating actions that involve objects or people in the environment. Now, can we think of any examples of this? Repetitive actions involving things in the environment. One example would be squeezing a rubber toy and realizing that it produces an interesting effect, like squeaking, then repeating it over and over. Could be also vocalizing by cooing. This is something we see young infants do a lot, is cooing. And through doing so, they realize the caregiver responds to their cooing, and they'll repeat the sounds that they're making to continue getting that positive response, furthering the cooing behaviors. So there are just a couple examples of secondary circular reactions. Let's show a short video as well of a baby experimenting with piano keys. All right, got a little composer there. So the baby is hitting the piano keys repetitively as they're beginning to learn that their actions produce a change in the environment. In this case, sound. It produces an interesting effect, so they repeat it over and over. This baby was very alert doing this. They realized that they were creating the sound that they were hearing, so they kept doing their repetitive action, which is hitting the piano keys. But you may notice they didn't have a whole lot of coordination, or even it didn't seem like there was really any intention or goals behind it. They were just repetitively hitting the keys to produce that interesting effect. So let's move to our next stage. This is where we do see goals introduced. So this is coordination of secondary circular reactions. So we still have secondary circular reactions in the picture, but now they're coordinating it specifically in terms of goal-directed behavior. So they're trying to achieve a goal now, and they're doing so with their behaviors. And this is believed to be an early form of problem solving. So what they're doing is they're combining schemas or actions, components of something to achieve a desired effect. So like crawling to pick a toy up from across the room, or pushing aside toys that are blocking the specific one that they want, or using a stick or object to reach something. You can see these are more complex behaviors, right? More complex than before. They're no longer just repetitive and kind of mindless just because they are enjoyable. Now they actually have goals in mind. So if we see the image here, you can see baby is crawling toward this object that's interesting. So they're combining crawling with their mental interest in this object, and they're combining these things to achieve their goal of reaching the object and playing with it. So this would be an example of step stage 4, coordinating secondary circular reactions. Now we have a little more in this substage to cover. So we're going to continue in the next slide. We're going to talk about object permanence, something some of you may have heard of before. So what we also see in this substage is the emergence of object permanence. This is understanding that objects exist even when they are out of view. So if you've ever played peekaboo with an infant or tried hiding something from them under a blanket or cloth, what was their reaction? This is going to depend on whether they have achieved object permanence, according to Piaget. So infants who have not achieved object permanence will show distress because they think you disappeared, or they might move their interest to something else because it seems like the object has become out of sight, out of mind. This is what we might see if they haven't reached object permanence yet. If they have achieved object permanence, what they'll likely do is try to search for you or search for the object that's hidden. So that's just one example, but let's actually watch a video here that illustrates this in effect. This is an example of a child who fails an object permanent test. Here, let's actually go into full mode.
What do you have? What do you have there? Is that your yummy giraffe? Let me see. Let me see. Can I see? Where'd he go? Where'd he go? Where's that giraffe? Okay.
Okay, so that was an example of failing the object permanence task, or one of a version of it. So what did we just watch? We saw this baby, and they saw the caregiver put the toy under the cloth multiple times in plain sight, right in front of the baby. Baby witnessed the whole process, but once it went under that cloth, it was like it disappeared into a void. The baby either lost interest or they kind of just looked around, and it's like it disappeared, right? So this baby does not have a sense of object permanence yet, according to Piaget. So object permanence usually emerges between 8 to 12 months, but at this point, I use the word emerge because it's when it's just starting. It's a very basic understanding and it's not going to be perfect. And this is evidenced by certain limitations and errors that we've seen in research, which we will talk about later today. But object permanence falls into this substage because it's a goal-directed behavior, right? Finding a hidden object that involves a goal, right? So that's kind of why it falls into this stage. And we do see it emerging during this time of 8 to 12 months, and coordinating and developing over time gets stronger and stronger. But that was an example of object permanence, and we'll come back to this topic a little bit later. But let's move to our fifth substage. This is tertiary circular reactions. So it's from about 12 to 18 months, and a child is beginning to explore new possibilities now. They're experimenting to see what the consequences will be. And oftentimes we'll refer to them as little scientists during this time because they're experimenting. They're trying to figure out the nature of objects and events. They're being creative and they're trying variations of original behaviors rather than just repeating the same behaviors, which is what we've seen in the past substages, right? So the difference here is they're doing variations of original behaviors now and really just experimenting. What are some examples? Like taking things apart, putting that back together. We see some toddlers doing this a lot. Dropping objects at different angles to see the changes in outcomes. Like the image here, a little child seems to have dropped their sippy cup, and most likely on purpose, because we know that a lot of toddlers drop things on purpose, especially from their high chairs. And the idea here is that they're doing it to kind of experiment to see what the outcome will be, what the consequence will be. So these things will often begin with an accident, and then they'll continue repeating the action with modifications each time. And at this point, what's going on is they're very curious. They're trying to learn even more about how they can modify their environment in terms of connection to cognitive development. So let's watch a short video of a child experimenting with pouring lentils into different containers and kind of see this tertiary circular reaction in action. All right, so this kid was pouring lentils into containers, and you can see that he's experimenting with different angles and methods of doing so, spun the tray around and used different containers and even ended up taking up the whole tray and using that to pour. So you could see that he tried different things, but you could also see that it was kind of in the moment, right? There didn't seem to be a whole lot of like planning. It was more just picking things up and experimenting, right? Almost like a little scientist. So exploring variables and consequences, no longer bound to those repetitive behaviors, but trying new things now. There are some limitations here, though. They can't really systematically reason or anticipate their consequences. They're very much in the here and now through trial and error. As I said, this child was very much just kind of picking things up and experimenting in the here and now. So we don't really see mental planning or organizing until the next stage, which leads us to our last substage. I forgot to change the 5 here. It's actually substage 6, my apologies, but this is representational thought. We can think of this as kind of the end goal of the sensorimotor period. This is when children are beginning to form mental representations of objects. So in other words, they're beginning to understand that they're understanding the world through mental operations rather than purely through their actions in the here and now. So essentially, they can now visualize things that are not physically present. And this comes along with a lot of abilities. So for one, engaging in pretend play. Things like pretending to be a doctor or pretending a banana is a phone. These would be examples of pretend play where one object represents another. So this is actually really complex, and it stems from this representational thought that emerges. We also have language in the picture now, much more strongly than the first year and a half. Vocabulary is developing significantly during this time. And if you think about it, words are essentially just symbols that represent something else. So we see a spurt in language development, which stems largely from this increase in representational thought. Also, they can start solving problems systematically rather than just through trial and error. So they're beginning to be able to mentally plan and organize before actually taking action. Also, it enables something called deferred imitation. This is the ability to imitate actions that they observed in the past. Complex stuff. So like imitating their parents drinking coffee and reading the paper, which is something they observed earlier that morning or something they see every morning. They're able to do this deferred imitation now. So representational thought is a huge milestone. It opens a lot of doors for their development, and it leads into the next stage in Piaget's theory, which we'll focus on in just a couple weeks. So Piaget's theory is widely used and replicated, and there seems to have a lot of validity, but there's also some criticisms. Some argue that infants have representational thought much earlier than he theorized, but they lack the various skills they need to demonstrate this ability in the traditional tasks that he proposed. So moving forward, we will explore some evidence about the criticisms of Piaget's theory. But for now, that just about covers the sensory motor period. So again, the end goal of this 2-year period is achieving representational thought, which leads them into the next stage, which we'll cover in a couple weeks. So this is kind of the journey of cognitive development according to Piaget in the first couple of years. So next we'll focus on conceptual development, but that concludes this video. So thank you for joining everyone. I will see you there.